Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information and extract the most important insights, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're embarking on an extraordinary journey through the early life and formative years of one of America's most iconic figures, Benjamin Franklin. You might think you know him, but his own words reveal a fascinating path of self-discovery, unexpected turns, and just this relentless pursuit of knowledge and public good.
Yeah, and what's great here is our main source is Franklin's own autobiography, well, the parts he wrote, plus a bit added by his friend, Dr. Stuber. So these are really intimate accounts. We get direct access to his thoughts, his motivations, even the errors, as he called them, that he candidly admits to. It gives us this incredibly personal window.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack those foundational experiences, the choices that shaped him, from his pretty humble beginnings right up to his huge contributions in science and public service just before the American Revolution really kicks off. Get ready for some surprising facts and maybe some aha moments about the man we usually picture with a kite. Okay, so let's dive into his origins. Franklin starts his autobiography by telling his son he's writing these anecdotes basically for the family to share the means, as he puts it, by which he rose from, poverty and obscurity to opulence and celebrity. But here's where it gets really striking, I think. He openly admits another motive, a desire to gratify my vanity. He even notes that anyone who denies vanity usually has quite a bit of it.
That self-awareness about vanity is actually pretty key to understanding him, isn't it? He wasn't just aware of it, he saw it as, well, advantageous, both for himself and for the people he influenced. It suggests this really pragmatic, almost utilitarian view of human nature right from the get-go.
Absolutely. He then gets into his family roots, tracing them back like 300 years to Eton in Northamptonshire. They lived on a small freehold. Blacksmithing was a family trade, passed down through the eldest sons.
And what's particularly revealing, I think, about his lineage is how early they embraced the Reformation.
Hmm.
During Queen Mary's reign, this is back in the mid-1500s, his great-grandfather hid their English Bible inside the lid of a close stool, a sort of commode. And they'd read it with a kid posted at the door as a lookout for the proctor, the official enforcing religious rules. That little detail really highlights this early spirit of, well, self-education and defiance in the family history.
Wow. Fast forward to his immediate family. His father, Josias, was originally a dyer. Married young, moved to New England around 1682, and had 13 kids. Franklin was the youngest son of the youngest branch. His mother, Abiah Folger, she was the daughter of Peter Folger, one of the early New England colonists Cotton Mather actually mentioned honorably. Now, you might imagine someone like Franklin had tons of formal education, but nope, he went to grammar school for scarcely a year. Rose quickly through the classes, apparently, but his dad pulled him out. Partly money troubles, partly because his father thought college grads were often poorly provided for. He then went to a different school for writing and arithmetic, mastered those pretty fast too.
Right, and this period is absolutely crucial for understanding Franklin's lifelong commitment to self-improvement. His father tried to get him into the family trade, candle making, but Franklin hated it. It sparked this strong desire for a life at sea. So to stop him running off, his dad took him around to watch various mechanics at work, carpenters, joiners, bricklayers. And Franklin later said that gave him his practical knowledge, how to build small things for his experiments. It really laid the groundwork for his hands-on approach.
And it wasn't just crafts. His early skill in swimming and handling boats was clear. He was almost always the leader of the troop, he says. He even tells this story about a youthful escapade, stealing stones from a mill pond to build a wharf for their fishing. Admits it was not conducted by justice. It's almost like you see these little glimmers of his future public spirit, even then, right? Though maybe a bit misguided at first.
You really do. And a lot of that public-mindedness seems to have been nurtured at home. His father, Josias, didn't really get into public life himself, too many kids to support, but leading men in town often consulted him on town and church matters. He had this reputation for sound understanding and solid judgment. Plus, he encouraged rational conversation at the dinner table. They never discussed food, apparently, but introduced useful or ingenious topics to shape the kids' minds. Franklin said this made him perfectly regardless of what kind of food was before me his whole life.
That's incredible. Franklin also talks about his uncle Benjamin, described as a man of piety who invented his own shorthand and collected political pamphlets. This uncle even offered to teach Ben shorthand, though Franklin says he never really used it and forgot it later. But it's clear that intellectual curiosity, that interest in public affairs, it really ran deep in the family. So, okay, formal schooling was minimal, but his journey of self-education is just phenomenal. He devoured his father's small library, lots of polemical theology, but also Plutarch's Lives. Later got access to more books from a Mr. Matthew Adams, an ingenious tradesman.
And what's really insightful are those early attempts at poetry. He wrote these ballads like The Lighthouse Tragedy and a song about capturing Blackbeard the pirate. His brother James printed them and they sold like hotcakes, a prodigious run. But his father just completely shut it down. Checked my exultation, Franklin wrote, by ridiculing my productions and telling me that versifiers were always poor. And Franklin believed this saved him from becoming a very wretched poet. That kind of blunt guidance, even harsh, profoundly shaped his focus towards prose.
Yeah, and he credits that skill in writing prose as being incredibly helpful throughout his life. He really worked at it, consciously imitating the Spectator essays. He'd summarize paragraphs, set them aside, try to reconstruct them from memory, compare his version to the original, constantly looking for synonyms, better ways to arrange things. It was this very deliberate, disciplined approach to mastering language.
It was a fascinating method, wasn't it? He even turned spectator stories into verse and then back into prose, just to build his vocabulary and flexibility. He explicitly said his goal was to acquire method in the arrangement of my thoughts and to succeed in time in writing decently in the English language. That ambition just drove this incredible early self-discipline.
And this commitment wasn't just intellectual. Around age 16, he reads a book by Tryon and decides to become a vegetarian. Saved half the money his brother paid for his board and used it to buy more books. That mix of frugality and resourcefulness, it really becomes a hallmark of his character, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Building on that, his use of the Socratic method is equally fascinating. He learned it from an English grammar book and Xenophon. Initially, he admits he used it to become a skeptic and get pretty adroit at winning arguments, getting concessions from people, even when maybe his points weren't that strong. But later, he consciously abandoned that blunt contradiction. He adopted a modest diffidence when expressing opinions, realizing that being dogmatic scarcely ever fails to disgust the hearer. That shows some real growth in rhetorical wisdom and, frankly, social skills.
Meanwhile, his apprenticeship with his brother James, who printed the New England Current, sounds like it was pretty rough. Severe and tyrannical treatment, Franklin called it. He actually attributes his lifelong aversion to arbitrary power directly to this experience. He secretly wrote anonymous pieces for the paper, and they were a hit. James's friends thought they were written by prominent local figures. When Ben finally revealed it was him, his brother's respect maybe increased a tiny bit, but the bad treatment didn't stop.
Yeah, it sounds brutal. And you have to wonder, was that harsh experience truly the main driver for his rebellious spirit and later commitment to liberty? Or was that maybe always part of him?
It's hard to imagine it wasn't a powerful catalyst. I mean, when his brother got jailed by the assembly for printing something offensive, Ben briefly took over the paper. Then, to avoid more trouble, they secretly tore up his old apprenticeship papers and signed a new private contract. Franklin admits he kind of dishonorably used this secret arrangement as an excuse to leave later on. He calls it one of the first errors of my life, but blames it on being embittered by all the blows he'd received. It's a very human admission.
And that desire for independence, or maybe just escape, ultimately pushed him out of Boston. His brother then apparently went around telling other printers not to hire him. So Franklin felt forced to flee. He heads to New York at just 17, hardly any money, knowing absolutely no one there. His friend Collins helped him arrange passage, even making up a story about Franklin having an affair to explain why he had to leave secretly. Quite the dramatic exit.
Yeah, and the journey to Philadelphia itself was just one mishap after another. He saved a drunken Dutchman from drowning, found his favorite book, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but it was in Dutch. Got a fever, cured himself by drinking cold water, got suspected of being a runaway servant, met some character named Dr. Brown, an infidel, who'd apparently tried to rewrite the Bible as a joke.
That's a vivid picture of a young guy, barely more than a boy, just trying to make his way. And then he finally arrives in Philadelphia. In my working dress, he says, covered with dirt, pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings, and basically broke just a Dutch dollar and about a shilling in copper coins. His first meal. 3 huge, puffy rolls. He's walking down the street, one under each arm, eating the third. Made a singular and grotesque appearance, apparently, to Miss Deborah Reed, his future wife, who saw him from her doorway. Then he wanders into a Quaker meeting house and promptly falls asleep. I mean, this image of him, so bedraggled but still going, it perfectly sets the stage for everything that follows.
And rise he did. Pretty quickly, he found work with a printer named Keimer. Keimer was a perfect novice with a beat-up press, and Franklin soon realized he was being outsmarted by the established printer Bradford, whom Franklin calls a cunning old fox. Franklin lodged with Mr. Reed Deborah's father and started making friends with other young people who liked reading. all while saving money through careful frugality.
And this is where things start to turn. Sir William Keith, the provincial governor, takes an interest. He was impressed by a letter Franklin had written to his brother-in-law. Keith praised his talents, proposed setting him up in his own printing business, promised government work, even offered a letter of credit to get funding from Franklin's father. It sounds like a dream ticket for a young guy like him, right? But it turns into a really powerful lesson about judging character, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Franklin goes back to Boston after being away 7 months, feeling pretty important. His family's thrilled to see him, well, maybe except his brother James. But his father, Josias, with that sound judgment, saw right through Governor Keith's promises. He basically said Keith showed very little discernment, thinking of setting up a teenager in business who wasn't even legally an adult yet. He told Ben to be polite to everyone, avoid satire, stay frugal and hardworking, and maybe he could set himself up by the time he was 21. Wise advice.
And that parental wisdom turned out to be spot on. Franklin heads back to Philadelphia, this time with his parents' blessing. But then another great error comes up. He'd been given some money to hold for a Mr. Vernon, but he ended up lending a lot of it to his friend Collins, the same friend who helped him leave Boston. Collins apparently became a drunkard, never repaid the money. Franklin even describes this dramatic scene where Collins refused to row their boat on the Delaware River, and they just left him behind to swim for it. It's such a stark contrast to the Keith situation this time. It's misplaced trust in a friend causing problems.
Right. And speaking of Keith's broken promises, Franklin eventually sails to England, fully expecting Keith's letters of credit and introductions. But he gets there and finds nothing. Keith was apparently a total knave, known for making promises he never intended to keep. A really painful experience, you imagine, but it taught him a crucial lesson about discerning character. And on that same voyage, he actually made a valuable friendship with a Mr. Denham, who clued him in to Keith's real reputation.
So while he's stuck in London, what does he do? He keeps improving himself, of course, works at Palmer's printing house, writes a small metaphysical piece arguing against a book called Religion of Nature, gets free access to a bookseller's circulating library, a very great advantage, he notes. He even meets some notable figures like Dr. Mandeville, author of The Fable of the Bees, and Sir Hans Sloane, the famous collector, who actually bought an asbestos purse Franklin had brought from America.
Huh? An asbestos purse. And it's during this time in London he gets that nickname, the American Aquatic, at another print shop, Watts. Why? Because he drank only water, while the 50 other workers drank beer all day. And apparently, he showed greater strength, carrying heavy trays of type with one hand when they needed two. He even tried to convince them that a penny loaf of bread and water gave more strength than beer for the same money, pointing out their voluntary wretchedness and poverty. It's just quintessential Franklin. Practical, economical, maybe a little bit preachy.
That anecdote really does capture his character, doesn't it? He also describes this run-in over garnish money. When he joined the compositors, it was custom to pay for drinks for everyone. He resisted at first, so they excommunicated him, played pranks, messing up his type, switching pages, blaming it on a spirit that haunted the chapel, which was their name for the print room. Eventually, he paid up, realizing the folly of not keeping up a good understanding with those among whom we are destined to live. It shows that pragmatic adaptability again, learning how to navigate social situations.
He also tells this interesting little story about lodging with an elderly Catholic woman, a clergyman's daughter, who lived this almost monastic life, ate mostly water gruel and half an anchovy, found her main entertainment in conversation. It just shows his openness to different ways of life, his curiosity about people.
Yeah, London was clearly a time of growth, but also, as he calls them, grand errors. His friend Ralph, who came over with him, tried being an actor, then a writer. He even started using Franklin's name while teaching school. Franklin lent him money, tried to talk him out of poetry, but then Ralph had an affair with a milliner, failed to repay Franklin, and they had a falling out. Franklin basically wrote it off as a relief from a very heavy burden. And then he admits that other grand error, completely neglecting his engagement back home to Deborah Reed.
Right, so when he finally gets back to Philadelphia in July 1726, he finds out Miss Reed had married someone else, a potter named Rogers. But then Rogers turned out to be a bigamist already married back in England, and he ran off. Franklin is very upfront, admitting his forgetfulness and inconstancy while in London were the principal part of her misfortune. Despite all the complications, they did eventually get married, September 1st, 1730. He notes she proved to me a good and faithful companion and contributed essentially to the success of my shop. He really frames it as correcting this great error of my youth. Okay, so back in Philadelphia, settled down, married, now Franklin really hits his stride. He forms a partnership with Hugh Meredith, whose father was supposed to put up the capital. Their very first job was printing some paper money for someone from the country. It earned them 5 shillings. Franklin famously said that gave him more pleasure than any sum I have since gained.
It's powerful, isn't it? That feeling of the first success, no matter how small, it can fuel you more than much larger gains later on. It's like it lays this psychological bedrock for the long haul. He also remembers this character, Samuel Mickle, this really morose guy who was always predicting Philadelphia's ruin, complaining about its decay, telling Franklin his printing business would fail. Franklin dryly notes that Mickle lived long enough to end up paying 5 times the original price for a house he'd initially refused to buy because he thought the city was doomed. A nice little jab at pessimism.
And a pivotal development around this time was the Ginto Club. This group of bright, intellectually curious young men met every week. They discussed politics, morals, natural philosophy, science. The members included a scrivener, a self-taught mathematician, Thomas Godfrey, who actually invented what became known as Hadley's Quadrant, but was apparently insupportable in company because he was so pedantic, a surveyor, a shoemaker who became a mathematician, and William Coleman, who became a future judge and lifelong friend of Franklin's.
The junto was way more than just a debating society. Franklin called it his best school for politics and morals. And, crucially, every member actively tried to procure work for Franklin Emeritus' printing firm. That helped them land important jobs, like printing the official history of the Quakers. Their combined, unwearied industry, as Franklin put it, quickly earned them a good reputation and credit. It completely turned around the general opinion that this new printing house was bound to fail. It was this early model of networking and mutual support that was just vital to their success.
Franklin even used a bit of competitive strategy. Remember George Webb, his former employee? Webb betrayed Franklin's secret plan to start a newspaper to his old boss, Keimer. So Franklin retaliates by writing these funny pieces under the name Busybody for the other paper, Bradford's. This drew attention, made him look clever, and ultimately helped him snag the lucrative job of printing for the Pennsylvania Assembly. Shows his sharp business mind and his wit.
And his pragmatic approach to business always seemed tied to his personal ethics, or at least his reputation. When Meredith's father couldn't pay the final installment on the printing press, Franklin was in a tight spot. 2 friends separately offered to lend him the money. Not wanting to favor one over the other, he accepted half from each, paid off the debt, and then dissolved the partnership with Meredith, who wasn't really pulling his weight anyway. He wrote that he took care not only to be really industrious and frugal, but also to avoid every appearance of the contrary. Dressed plainly, avoided pubs and games, it all helped build his credit and character in the community.
He also got involved in the big debate about paper currency, wrote an anonymous pamphlet, an inquiry into the nature and necessity of paper currency. It really appealed to the lower and middling classes, as the source says, and it helped convince the assembly to issue more paper money. And guess who got the job printing those bills? Franklin's firm, a very lucrative employment.
His public service definitely expanded quickly beyond just printing. He became postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737 and showed some real nobleness of soul, according to the account, by not using his position to retaliate against Bradford, the rival printer, who had previously tried to hinder the circulation of Franklin's newspaper. He also proposed big changes to the city's night watch system to make them more effective, and in 1744 suggested a voluntary association for the defense of the province against potential French or Spanish attacks, which got something like 10,000 signatures.
Right. And this is where his scientific side really takes off. He invented the Pennsylvania fireplace, what we often call the Franklin stove, around 1745. It was a much, much more efficient way to heat a room compared to open fireplaces. Very practical.
But yeah, the electrical experiments are probably his most famous scientific work. It all got kicked off by a glass tube and some instructions sent over by Peter Collinson in London in 1745. Franklin just dove in. He meticulously experimented, and by 1747, he discovered the power of points, how sharp points draw off or throw off electrical charge more effectively. And crucially, he came up with the grand discovery of positive and negative electricity, the whole plus and minus concept. Some in England disputed it, but the timeline clearly shows it was his idea first. Then he figured out how the Leyden jar worked, which had puzzled everyone.
Then in 1749, he gets this astonishingly bold and grand idea, as the source puts it. Maybe lightning and the aurora borealis are electrical phenomena, and even more radical, maybe you could actually draw down lightning using sharp, pointed iron rods. This led directly to inventing the lightning rod. It's a perfect example of his desire to be useful to mankind, taking scientific theory and turning it into something life-saving.
And that practical proof came with his most famous experiment, the kite experiment, in June 1752. It definitively confirmed his theory that lightning was electricity. Feeling that spark jump from the key tied to the kite stream must have been an exquisite sensation, as the account says. It validated everything and just catapulted him to international scientific fame. His book, New Experiments and Observations on Electricity, was published, translated, even demonstrated for the King of France. Despite some attempts in Europe to downplay his work, his contributions were undeniably foundational, really revolutionary for the time.
And beyond those huge things, he also invented the glass harmonica, this elegant musical instrument made of spinning glass bowls. He developed it from a cruder version someone else had made. And on a sea voyage in 1762, he made that famous observation about how pouring oil on rough water smoothed the waves. Though, interestingly, the source notes that even by the time it was written, no one had a really satisfactory scientific explanation for why that works. Just shows his endless curiosity. Franklin's influence just kept growing. In 1753, he was appointed Deputy Postmaster General for all the British colonies in North America, a huge step up, and he managed the system so well it eventually turned a profit thrice as much, the source says, as that of Ireland.
And this is where we really see him moving on to the larger stage of statesmanship. His Albany Plan of Union in 1754, proposing a unified colonial government for defense against the French and their Native American allies. It's just fascinating as a precursor to the U.S. Constitution. It suggested a Grand Council with representatives from each colony based on population and a President General appointed by the Crown. But what's really insightful is that both sides rejected it. The British government thought it gave too much power to the colonies, and the colonial assemblies thought it gave too much power to the Crown.
And Franklin, in his typical pragmatic way, saw that dual rejection as proof of its merit. He figured it must have steered exactly in the middle. But this raises that huge historical what if, doesn't it? If the Albany Plan had been adopted, could it have prevented the American Revolution?
Well, the source writing about this speculates probably not, actually. It argues that even with the plan, British trade restrictions would likely still have caused conflict, and the President General, being loyal to the Crown, would inevitably have clashed with the colonial assemblies. So the underlying tensions would probably still have pushed the colonies towards independence once they felt strong enough. Maybe slowed it down, but not stopped it. An inevitable tide, perhaps.
Interesting. Then in 1755, during the French and Indian War, specifically General Braddock's disastrous expedition, Franklin played a key role. He and his son managed to round up 150 wagons and horses for the army, basically saving the logistics of the campaign. He even put up his own money as bond, incurring significant personal debt, though Governor Shirley later arranged for him to be reimbursed. He also got a militia bill passed in Pennsylvania. This was tricky because the Quakers' pacifist principles, but the bill allowed men to choose whether to serve, and as Franklin Riley noted, the Quakers had no objection to their neighbors fighting for them. Franklin himself was even made a colonel and led troops out to the frontier to build forts.
And what's really telling is that the British government later disapproved of Pennsylvania having its own effective militia act. They apparently wanted to keep the colonies dependent, and specifically, not that the Americans should become acquainted with their own strength. That just clearly illustrates the diverging interests, the seeds of conflict, even in things like organizing local defense.
Right. Meanwhile, these ongoing warm disputes between the Pennsylvania Assembly and the proprietors, the Penn family who owned the colony, led to Franklin being sent back to England as the Assembly's agent in 1757. He stayed for several years and was ultimately successful in arguing that the proprietors' vast estates should be taxed fairly, just like other Pennsylvanians' property. A real testament to his integrity and his persuasive skills over there.
And during that long stay in England, his reputation just soared. He received honorary degrees from universities like St. Andrews, Edinburgh, Oxford, became a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was truly an international figure, a respected philosopher and scientist. He also published his influential Canada pamphlet in 1759, arguing strongly that Britain should take Canada from the French as part of the peace settlement, seeing it as crucial for the American colony's future security and economic growth.
He finally returned to America in 1762. The Pennsylvania Assembly formally thanked him and gave him £5,000 for his service, but he jumped right back into local issues. Most notably, the Paxton Boys incident in 1763. This was when a mob of frontiersmen, angry about frontier attacks, massacred a group of peaceful, assimilated Native Americans living near Lancaster. Then they marched on Philadelphia, threatening another group of friendly Indians who had sought refuge there. Franklin, along with others, rode out to meet the mob and actually managed to persuade them to turn back. A dangerous moment.
It really shows his continued standing and influence, even when facing down an angry mob. Interestingly, though, Franklin actually lost his seat in the Assembly in the 1764 election, partly due to opposition stirred up by the proprietors he'd battled in London. But almost immediately, the Assembly reappointed him as their agent to go back to England. It's like he was indispensable to them, even when he wasn't technically an elected official anymore.
So back to London he goes, and in 1766, he's famously called before the House of Commons during the heated debates about repealing the Stamp Act. His testimony was apparently crucial. The source highlights the extent and accuracy of his information about the colonies and the facility with which he communicated his sentiments. His clear arguments about colonial opposition and the economic folly of the act were seen as instrumental in getting it repealed. After that, he traveled a bit on the continent, Holland, Germany, France, meeting scientific and literary figures, even King Louis XV.
Then comes 1773, and his decision to leak those private letters written by Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver. The letters revealed their anti-colonial views and suggested reducing colonial liberties. Publishing them caused a massive uproar in Massachusetts and back in England. It even led to a duel between two other men over who leaked them. Franklin then publicly stepped forward, claiming responsibility for sending the letters to America, though he refused to name his source in England. It was an incredibly audacious political move, really cementing his role as a champion for American rights, but it carried huge personal risk.
Yeah, and the backlash was severe. His final attempts to reconcile Britain and the colonies included this absolutely humiliating appearance before the Privy Council in London in 1774. He was investigating the Hutchinson Letters affair and was just subjected to vicious public abuse, particularly from Solicitor General Wedderburn. He stood there silent through the whole thing. Realizing reconciliation was probably hopeless, he returned to America in 1775, arriving just as the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. He was immediately elected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress.
He really threw himself into the cause then, didn't he? Even after all those years trying to bridge the gap. He went on a mission to Canada trying to persuade them to join the colonies, but it failed, partly due to religious differences between the largely Catholic Canadians and Protestant Americans. He participated in feudal peace talks with British Admiral Lord Howe, who basically offered only pardons upon submission. After seeing these doors close, Franklin became a firm advocate for independence. He influenced others in Congress and likely encouraged Thomas Paine to write Common Sense. His pragmatic mind saw independence as the only viable path forward now.
He then served as president of the convention that drafted Pennsylvania's new state constitution in 1776. And then, of course, came his most crucial diplomatic role, envoy for France. His immense reputation there as a scientist and philosopher was invaluable. He charmed Parisian society and skillfully navigated the complex diplomacy, ultimately securing the critical Franco-American alliance in 1778. That alliance, especially after the American victory at Saratoga, was absolutely vital to winning the Revolutionary War. He also later negotiated treaties with Sweden in 1783 and Prussia in 1785.
And even amidst all that high-stakes diplomacy, he kept his scientific mind engaged. In 1784, while still in Paris, he was part of a royal commission appointed by the French king to investigate animal magnetism, the controversial theories of Franz Mesmer. Franklin and the commission basically debunked mesmerism, concluding it was largely due to imagination or mere trick. When he finally returned to Philadelphia in 1785, after nearly a decade abroad, he was greeted as a hero. He was immediately elected president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, essentially the governor, and served 3 terms. And in 1787, despite his age and frail health, he served as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, lending his immense prestige to the effort and ultimately signing the U.S. Constitution.
His later years were profoundly dedicated to social causes, things he clearly cared deeply about. He became president of 2 important societies founded in 1787. One focused on alleviating the suffering of prisoners, and the other dedicated to promoting the abolition of slavery. His very last public act, just months before he died, was signing a memorial to the U.S. Congress, urging them to abolish the slave trade. He followed that up with his incredibly sharp satirical essay, written under the pseudonym Historicus, where he parodied the arguments used to defend the African slave trade by applying them to the historical enslavement of Christians by North African pirates. A powerful final statement. Benjamin Franklin passed away on April 17, 1790, at the age of 84. His epitaph, which he'd actually written for himself many years earlier, it just perfectly captures his whole outlook on life and legacy, I think. It reads, "The body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. Yet the work itself shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by the author."
It's such a profound summary of his life, isn't it? This idea of constantly seeking to correct and amend both himself and the world around him. And his will really reveals that same long term vision. He left significant funds, £1,000 sterling each, to his beloved cities of Boston and Philadelphia, but with specific instructions. The money was to be lent out at 5% interest to young married artificers, skilled tradesmen, starting out for a full 100 years. After that century, the vastly increased funds were to be used for major public works, things like fortifications or bringing fresh water into the cities. And he calculated that after 200 years, the sums would grow to over £4 million sterling, with further plans for their use then.
And he was really explicit about why he was doing this. In a codicil to his will, he noted he'd never inherited a shilling from any ancestor or relation, and he wanted to find a way to be useful even after my death, informing and advancing other young men, just like he had been helped. He also bequeathed his walking stick, the one with the gold cap of liberty on top, to General Washington, with the words, "If it were a scepter, he has merited it and would become it," a powerful gesture of respect.
It's just astonishing that forward thinking in his bequests, aiming to foster civic improvement literally for centuries. It really speaks to his belief in compound growth, not just financially, but in human potential, in shaping the future long after he was gone.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, the learner? Franklin's autobiography and the accounts of his life, they're clearly more than just history. It feels like a kind of blueprint for self-improvement and for civic engagement. He was so open about his errors, as he called them, and the lessons he learned.
Right. And it raises that question, doesn't it? If Franklin, with all his incredible genius and achievements, could openly acknowledge his missteps, his first errors, his forgetfulness and inconstancy, and consciously work to correct them, how might acknowledging our own flaws and errors become the very foundation for our most significant growth, both personally and professionally?
Yeah, think about his willingness to adapt his opinions and behaviors. Moving from being a dogmatic debater to a more humble questioner, or even shifting his diet when needed. That flexibility allowed him to thrive in so many different situations. So in your own pursuit of knowledge, your own personal development, where might a similar kind of flexibility, that willingness to admit past errors, maybe take a different approach, and always keep that long-term vision in mind, where might that open up unexpected paths for your own new and more beautiful edition?